Hello, I'm Shannon Tiesi from the Diplomat, and I'm joining you here today from the Center for a New American Security. I'm very happy to be joined by Dr. Patrick Cronin. He is the director of the Asia program here at CNAS. Dr. Cronin, thank you for joining us.
It's my pleasure, Shannon.
In early May, China set an oil rig to drill in the South China Sea near Vietnam's borders and also near the disputed Paracel Islands. China claims the oil drill is operating within its territory. Vietnam claims it's a violation of its own exclusive economic zone. This has resulted in several naval clashes on the ocean where ships were rammed and water cannons were fired. Diplomatic tensions are high, and there's even been riots in Vietnam. Dr. Cronin, some people have said that the placement of this oil ridge is a game changer in the South China Sea that will alter the way that China interacts with its neighbors and handles its claims. What's your take on this?
Well, game changer is a faddish term, and I think I would probably resist using that phrase, but I think this does represent a disturbing pattern on the part of China. A more confident China is trying to assert its influence and control over its near seas. And it's doing so through newfound capacities. And one new capacity is that it now has the kind of oil rig that can go and do the deep sea drilling that it wasn't able to do without international vendors and oil companies in the past. So in that sense, this is a new capacity. Just as China's growing Coast Guard provides it with much more reach and influence to enforce fishing rules, to enforce its own interpretation of its boundaries. And that's the problem. We don't know who owns this water. We know that they're in dispute. And so any unilateral changes through this kind of coercive action, and this is coercive action on the part of China, is very disturbing to others in the region, not just Vietnam, but also the Philippines, but the United States and others outside of the region who are depending on a calm and peaceful South China Sea through which so many different countries transit.
Now, obviously, Vietnam has been very vocal about decrying this move. They've also sent their own vessels there to confront the Chinese ships. But short of an actual military confrontation, which Vietnam has said they're not going to pursue, what are their options for dealing with this move by the Chinese?
Well, nobody wants a conflict, and I think that includes the Chinese. But the Chinese are willing to deploy a risk more than, say, the Vietnamese, the Philippines, smaller countries that really can't afford to get into a fight with China. I think the options, therefore, are diplomatic, legal, political, economic. And so people are talking about trying to seek international arbitration, the way the Philippines is currently seeking resolution through the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea. That's no panacea. That's a multi-year legal attempt to try to get a body in Europe to essentially say, look, we've interpreted the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, and we think your 9-line claim in the South China Sea has to be based on land features rather than just historical claim, as the Chinese often make the case. So that's a very slow process, and there's no guarantee in the meantime that China will play by the rules in the meantime, or that it will abide by the ruling if there is a ruling. Another approach is political, and I think that's where the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, different countries, these 10 countries each have different interests vis-a-vis China. Only 4 of them are claimants in the South China Sea, Malaysia, Brunei, Vietnam, and the Philippines. And they even have different interests and some overlapping claims. But at least ASEAN was able this past month to put out a statement, not pinpointing China, but indirectly, basically saying China's disturbing the peace by this unilateral change of the status quo. That's a political expression, a diplomatic expression. I think that's important. Diplomatically and militarily, there are things that can be done in terms of cooperation with other countries. The Philippines and Vietnam are suddenly more in lockstep with one another in opposing China, both through diplomatic statements, possibly through legal action, but they're also working with other countries. Japan, for instance, is helping both Vietnam and the Philippines with Coast Guard ships and patrol boats. The United States is helping both Vietnam and the Philippines separately in different ways to build some capacity, some modicum of a capacity to have better coastal defense, and including a Coast Guard as well as a Navy and air defense, so that it can at least say, look, China, don't go barging in here unilaterally. Let's make sure that we're agreeing on the rules of the road before you try to change the status quo.
So Vietnam is starting to explore its options for pushing back against China. And we've also seen a very fierce political response from the general population in Vietnam, including a series of anti-China riots that broke out near Ho Chi Minh City, actually targeting not just Chinese, but Taiwanese, South Korean, Singaporean factories. Given this, what do you think the long-term implications are going to be for the China-Vietnam bilateral relationship?
China and Vietnam have lived next to each other throughout their histories. They're going to continue to do so throughout the rest of their histories. And it's a complex relationship. Even while they've had many disputes and some fights and some conflicts, they've also expanded their economic commerce. They've expanded their political ties, certainly between the two communist parties in charge of these governments. And they have even joint naval patrols. Now, they're largely symbolic, and they're largely up in the north where there's an area of an agreement, not the south where there are bigger problems along fisheries and oil exploration zones. Nonetheless, I think these tensions in Vietnam, including the deaths and the casualties, are very unfortunate, but they're a reflection of how much national identity there is in Vietnam, as there is in China, frankly, on sovereignty issues. And I believe that these issues are quite explosive. This is where escalation can happen. So even something that happens in the South China Sea can escalate on shore. That could escalate back in China, as it did. There was pressure on Xi Jinping's government to put pressure back on Vietnam and to do something. And I think that is a real pressure point on the Chinese government. So these things could escalate in a way that would be very, very unhelpful. And I think that's the problem. We do not have the kind of agreed protocol that are binding hotlines, for instance, that really ensure that tensions will not escalate. And that's a concern.
And you spoke earlier about Vietnam reaching out to the Philippines. There's also been some talk of discussions among Vietnam, the Philippines, and Malaysia jointly on how to deal with China. Do you think we're going to start to see more of a united front amongst the other South China Sea claimants, or are their own disputes with each other going to prevent that?
I think the claimant states in the South China Sea, and there we are talking about Malaysia, Brunei, which is smaller than Malaysia, Philippines, and Vietnam, those four claimant states, I think, are likely to seek greater cooperation in the future, at least diplomatically, if not in terms of actual patrols or other legal recourse that they may take with the International Tribunal, or the search for assistance through ASEAN or through the United States or other outside countries. I think that is likely to grow in response to Chinese actions and assertiveness. The Chinese are careful to try to tailor their coercion and their action to not trigger something that would mobilize the region against them. They're very wary of that. They think any action or cooperation against them is containing China. But it's actually the self-defense mechanism of smaller countries, frankly, arrayed around China, to try to figure out how do you force this rising, emerging, confident China with more capabilities to play by rules that are agreed to by the region. And that's why there's this long-standing search for a code of conduct, for instance, in the South China Sea. Unfortunately, there's nothing binding at this point. It's dragged on for years. It's likely to continue to drag on. Xi Jinping has just called at a new confidence-building measures summit for a new architecture, including something like a code of conduct. But this has been on the table. China can accept it. They just have been unwilling to be bound by rules that are multilateral when it comes to restricting how China will operate in what it considers to be its sphere of influence. That's the real problem. It's also interesting to note that as Russia and China conduct exercises right now, sign a big gas deal, that Russia, interestingly, is selling Vietnam its most potent maritime weapon, the submarine. And that's a very tricky bit of diplomacy on the part of Vladimir Putin, I imagine, trying to tell President Xi, don't worry, these submarines are better coming from us than from the United States, which we wouldn't sell our nuclear submarines. But nonetheless, it's very interesting that here you have China's ostensible ally in Russia, actually selling Vietnam the one military instrument that really scares the Chinese because it's a very stealthy platform in the South China Sea, a diesel submarine.
Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. But thank you so much for helping us talk through some of these issues.
Thank you so much.
And thank you for joining us. Once again, I'm Shannon Tiezi from The Diplomat.